Today we are going to talk about muscle cramping.
Mm-hmm.
Why do muscles cramp? Let's think of a smarter way to understand it. And so my perception is that muscle cramping is due to lack of banana intake.
Come on.
Very specifically.
Monkeys do not cramp.
Welcome back, PYP crew. It's Past Your Prime, episode number 18. I'm Alex, Spiker Keicher on Instagram. This is Craig Smith PT on Instagram. He's a physical therapist. I have enormous calves, a great voice, and I spike volleyballs.
Real hard.
Real hard.
Yep, you volley hard too.
Volley so hard.
He volleys real hard.
He clinics real hard.
I do. I treat really hard. So stupid.
Alrighty.
You do look taller now. We just recorded a comment section and he looked like a small person, and now he's actually taller than me, if you were wondering.
Yeah. I did some lumbar traction and some push-ups. Anyway. So let's jump into injury updates really quick.
Let's do it.
Injury updates with Alex and Craig.
Cue the music. Once again, it's
just all about me.
It's actually, we should call it Alex's injury update from now on.
We might have to do that.
Yeah.
Really no major changes this week. I'm convinced that Craig has a voodoo doll of me, that he just pokes at little things from recent podcasts so that he can use me as a lab rat, because my foot hurts. I've been having morning foot pain all of a sudden. Not in the FDB, but still I had some bottom of the foot cramping while playing volleyball on Tuesday.
Seriously?
Just a tiny bit. It was just like one jump, and I was like, "What? Felt weird. Why is Craig playing with my voodoo doll right now?"
Oh, that makes me honestly very happy. Was it like the base of your foot, or?
It was just like it felt like a straight line in the middle of my foot. I don't want to say snapped, but it was about to snap for a second, and then it went away, and I haven't felt it since. But
I'm so pumped. I often think that he actually hurts everywhere. I think when I point something out in the body, he just realizes, oh yeah, what I was feeling down there is actually pain, not. I'm not even sure what your brain interprets it.
Not just a regular good feeling.
No, yeah, that really makes my day.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
My tricep hurts. My TFL is getting a little bit better. The tricep came out of nowhere. You mentioned my shoulder the other day. My shoulder's been achy now because you asked about my shoulder the other day.
How's your back?
It depends on if I deadlift or not. I think
your back is
we'll talk about that a little bit today in terms of back stiffness.
With this level of like power, I am actually a little nervous of like what I could suggest could hurt to you right now.
Please don't. Please don't. And my wrist is actually feeling pretty good today.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm thinking after my next major volleyball competition, I might let you mobilize it. Because then I'll be in a place where I can deal with some pain for a while afterwards.
Honestly, I think Sarah will kibosh that idea, but yeah. I would like the opportunity.
I wouldn't, but I'll let you do it if you think it's going to let me do a hang clean front squat or push-up sometime in my future.
Yes, it will.
Yeah.
100%.
Alrighty. So episode 18, today we are going to talk about muscle cramping.
Mm-hmm.
Why do muscles cramp? Let's think of a smarter way to understand it. And so my perception is that muscle cramping is due to lack of banana intake.
Come on.
Very specifically.
Monkeys do not cramp.
Yeah. One of my favorite movies is Borat, and superior potassium is supposed to get rid of all cramping. You're telling me this is false?
I would suggest that is not accurate. Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
All right. So why do muscles cramp if it's not my Pedialyte intake?
Do you drink Pedialyte?
I love, we've talked about this before.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Pedialyte, we talked about it a little bit before this podcast, not Pedialyte specifically, but I was at one point convinced, and I think you'll change my mind today, but that Pedialyte would prevent me from cramping.
Yeah. No, it doesn't.
Oh.
What I find interesting, so how I started to go down this route of looking at muscle cramps was that I saw it all the time. Some people would come in where they had a primary cramping complaint, like I was having cramps at night in my calf. This cramp would wake me up in the middle of the night, and all of a sudden I'd scream, get out of bed. I have to stretch my foot back to release the calf. And I really wanted to dig into what the heck was happening and see if there was a thought process around how to treat it. And there was an original article, it was either 1997 or 2009, written by Schwellnus, is I think how you actually say the guy's name. And he put forward this idea of altered neuromuscular states causing people to be predisposed to cramping. And the idea was very different than what the traditional model of the idea of cramping. Some of the original research was actually looking at people who were in like hot workplaces, fatigued and dehydrated. And those things were like kind of all looked at together. And those individuals were more predisposed to cramping and were seen to cramp more. And then you had a lot of anecdotal evidence and people's reports where cramping was happening when they were sweating too much, seems like they were dehydrated and likely had an electrolyte imbalance. All of those things together have kind of led to this industry developing where people could buy a drink like a Gatorade, right? You have this quench my thirst, this you want to make sure you want to get rid of this cramp, you take a salt tablet or consume this electrolyte mix of a drink, and those things are going to prevent you from cramping. The issue is that studies that have looked at this have found almost no support for the idea that dehydration or electrolyte imbalances actually cause cramping. And if you think of it from like a logical standpoint, you wouldn't expect like a local event, like a singular muscle or even multiple muscles cramping in an area. That wouldn't make you think of a systemic issue like dehydration. You don't dehydrate in a single area. You dehydrate through your whole body. You also wouldn't think of electrolyte imbalance. You don't develop an imbalance just in one spot. It would be a systemic event and you should see cramping everywhere. So just from a logical standpoint, it didn't make sense. And to me, that was kind of where it started for me. And then reading this article really sent me down this whole different pathway of what causes the muscle to actually cramp. And that's so the traditional model basically just did not explain what I was seeing clinically.
Okay, so if we're saying that it's not your electrolytes, not your banana intake, not the amount of liquid IVs you can shove into a water bottle, why has this been a misconception, I guess, for so long now?
I honestly think it's because there's such a huge marketing push and a humongous industry supporting the idea that electrolytes and dehydration drive cramping.
Well,
I mean,
and
what do you think about
like
that?
most of my cramping has been pretty much primarily in my calves, a little bit in the foot recently, but that's just due to your voodoo. I mean, I guess I use my calves a lot when playing sports, when playing volleyball, when jumping, playing basketball. So I guess, the theory in terms of your whole body doesn't cramp at one time, it's just a localized muscle, I guess would lean towards it being a specific muscle. But I guess I also felt that the days where I had my bananas, I had my Pedialyte, I wasn't necessarily cramping. So does nutrition play into it at all?
I
Or
I do think that cramping can be a multifactorial issue, meaning there can be multiple things that contribute. I would say the nutrition and the electrolyte and the hydration piece is the smallest part, if there is a part from it.
are there situations where that is the reason, or is that just like outdated thinking now?
I think it's outdated thinking. What I'm saying is that if you look at your muscle, the way your muscle fires, there's a certain threshold that has to be passed for the muscle to actually engage and become active. That threshold is dynamic, meaning that it's not set in stone, that
Changes.
it changes. It changes based off a whole bunch of factors. And also, altered neuromuscular state, what's happening is you have what's called a Golgi tendon organ, which we won't say that again. We'll say GTO from now on.
I like the word Golgi because it reminds me of bulgogi, which is my favorite Korean marinated meat. So I'm happy to say, but can we say Golgi?
Golgi, yeah. All right, so the Golgi tendon organ. Well, I'll say GTO. He'll continue to say Golgi.
I'll remember it better that way, at least.
So think of the GTO as inhibitory. What that means is that it shuts your muscle off. Okay, so it's a negative sign. And then you also have what's called a muscle spindle. And the muscle spindle is excitatory, meaning it's a plus sign. When we look at the threshold and that you're going to have to pass, the Golgi tendon organ means that it makes the muscle harder to fire, whereas a muscle spindle brings it down so it's easier to fire. Okay. And that interaction, anything that plays with those two systems, with either the muscle spindle or the GTO, has the opportunity to make it easier for you to cramp. Does that make sense?
Right. Or for the muscle not to fire correctly.
You've got it. For it to become dysfunctional.
I'm just getting a weird thought process here because we've talked about how like my approach jump has not been the same since coming back from my wrist injury. And I wonder if like just my muscles are not neurally functioning the right way to be able to get the full use out of them.
I 100% think that when people have cramping or when they have any of these issues that develop, or you have time where you're out and you don't feel as athletic, I absolutely think those are implicated. But like a really clear sign of dysfunction is cramping. So if you feel what you're describing, like that can absolutely be, I think, another dysfunction that you're catching from those two nerves interplaying. But for cramping, I think it's directly implicated, and the research is by far the strongest and well supported for this type of thing happening, being the driver. I think it just doesn't go far enough.
And part of me feels like I'm just kind of fatigued. I've been lifting a lot and haven't deloaded in a while. So like, how does fatigue play a part in muscle cramping?
Fatigue is absolutely indicated. So if you pre-fatigue a muscle, once again, that acts as a direct implication on the GTO, the Golgi gets less active. So you're not getting the inhibitory aspect into the muscle, and so it becomes easier for it to fire. A perfect example of the GTO in action is if you do have a cramp, like say in your calf, what do you do first?
I just cry.
He cries like a child.
Yeah, and you're supposed to pull it up.
Pull it up.
Yeah,
so that you stretch the calf
towards your head.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what that does is that activates the Golgi tendon organ that's in the Achilles tendon, and that causes the calf to quit activating. So basically acts as the muscle activation. That would be a sign of the inhibitory aspect of the GTO.
We might hit it later in this, but if you're a calf cramper, heel locks are my magic key for making my calves feel better.
Well, heel locks operate in a different pattern, in that's reciprocal inhibition. So that's you're firing the muscle on the opposite side, your anterior tibialis, your extensoralis longus, and extensor digitorum longus. We call them the pretibials as a group. That's another thing that happens is in people who have like a muscle that gets inhibited, and say like for whatever reason, a common thing that can happen is if you have like a low back injury and you have something that makes those muscles on the front of your leg. Like, have you ever heard the term foot drop?
No.
Foot drop.
Is it like footloose?
No. So stupid. I like it.
Yeah. I tried.
I do like footloose though. Foot drop is where you lose the strength of those pretibials. It can be because of a nerve injury. It can be commonly from a back injury. And you get this thing where people's foot like slaps on the ground every time they take a step. You get foot slap, just kind of.
It's weird. Okay.
But when you lose that reciprocal inhibition, it's more easy for you to get cramping. So that's another aspect of what changes the threshold is the activation of the muscle that does the opposite. That would be another thing that can change it. And in that situation, what he was talking about with his calves cramping is pulling the toes up causes reciprocal inhibition, not a stretch of the Golgi tendon organ, but it causes another input to the muscle threshold.
And less emphasis on the calf muscle, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so moving on, we wanted to talk about why cramping happens in specific movements. The one I think of, I was getting my TFL checked out a couple of weeks ago, and I had my heel brought to my butt and some resistive pressure put against it, and my hamstring immediately cramped. I made a weird oh!
It is a shocking experience, right?
Yeah, I was not expecting it, I'll tell you that.
So there's certain muscles that are going to be predisposed to cramping. Those are going to be what we call biarticulate muscles. So those are muscles that cross more than one joint. Your hamstring would be an example of one of them. It crosses your hip joint, it crosses your knee joint. When you were on your stomach, right? Yep. He was on his stomach. His knee was bent to 90 degrees. His hip was in full hip extension, and that shortens the hamstring muscle. And that's called active insufficiency. When you have a muscle in that type of position, it basically predisposes. You lose basically all inhibitory influence from that Golgi tendon organ, the GTO, the Golgi.
Golgi.
You lose it all from the Golgi, and you only get the muscle spindle input. And now when you apply pressure, it just goes through the roof. The exercise that also you see that is bridge.
Oh, hip
Hip
bridges.
bridges, right?
Yeah.
And the reason you feel that in your hamstring is the very same fact. You're moving into hip extension. Your knees are bent to about 90, and if your glutes are working really well, great, because that'll keep it from happening. But if you're hamstring dominant, you will absolutely get a cramp there, and it's because you're taking the hamstring into a position of active insufficiency.
I've added those to my warm up in like the last month or two since having this severe cramp.
That's what's kind of fun when you catch something like a cramp in the hamstring and you find an exercise that causes it. If you can figure out the solution, that exercise actually becomes therapeutic and it prevents you from developing that synergistic compensation, which we'll get into that one next.
And it's a double for me because it helps with the TFL as well. So
100%. That's a fantastic exercise.
Agreed.
The other one that I really see a lot is sustained positions. This is the one that I think of with cramping at night.
Okay. So not like an isometric hold, but when
No.
you're just like unknowingly in the same position.
Yeah, laying flat on your back and your feet are plantar flex, and your calf is in a shortened position again, even if it's not active when you're doing it. Like when you first wake up and you kind of stretch and you fire all your muscles, there's a reason why that's why it causes a cramp. You basically have had it in this position where there's no input from the GTO. You fire your muscle even at a low level, and it basically goes 0 to 60 immediately, and you go all out and have a cramp. So if you're somebody who notices that sleep position and was often going to be the driver of it.
Can you explain a little bit more about active insufficiency?
Yeah.
I know we just talked about that and I had asked you about it before. I still don't fully understand it, but
okay, yeah.
It's kind of like compensatory muscles playing against the actual muscle that's trying to fire.
So active insufficiency is talking about specifically about one muscle. When I talk about synergistic dominance, that's what I'm talking about, more than one muscle that are providing similar actions. So yeah, we'll get really clear on that. An active insufficiency is anytime you take a muscle and you put it in a really shortened position and then ask it to fire. That's active insufficiency. There's reasons that it happens. If you look at the actual muscle itself, you're getting crossover of muscle filament, like these muscle filaments that these cross bridges. It's basically not in a optimized place to contract. And once that happens, you've basically compromised its ability to fire. So you have to actually typically engage even more of the muscle to be able to be successful with that whatever task you're placing on it. And then on top of it, you are getting no input from the Golgi tendon organ. So,
how do you fix it?
Well, so the biggest thing is you have to make sure before you even get into that position, you have the threshold high enough that it won't overactivate. So it's one of those things where you have to fix it before you try to train it. And it's really useful, but then there's a whole bunch of things, like I said, that could implicate and reduce the threshold, like pain, synergistic dominance. So to compare active insufficiency to synergistic dominance, which this is a term that I've kind of coined just to help think about it. Like if you think about plantar flexion, like the ability to go up on a single leg and calf raise, right? You typically think of your gastroc and your soleus, right? But that's not the only muscles that plantar flex your foot. You have your flexor halis longus, your flexor digitorum longus, your posterior tibialis, your proneus longus, and your proneal brevis. All of those muscles will plantar flex your foot. And what can happen is like some of those muscles may be completely inactive, and you have one muscle who's now trying to do everything, and none of the support structures are helping at all. If like with your calf, if his calf was cramping, I would work on every muscle that also helped with plantar flexion and make sure that they're active. So it reduces the overload that can happen with that muscle. A really common one though is if you have a glute amnesia or glute inhibition from like back pain, your hamstring is going to try to take up the slack. And so it's not supposed to be as active with hip extension. If you try to extend your hip and you feel your hamstring cramp, it's because your glute's not doing what it's supposed to. And so that's where you get I call it synergistic dominance. It's when these muscles that should work together, you have one that's doing too much, and that can also reduce the threshold and allows it to fire too easy.
Right. You had mentioned a couple of the calf muscles there, so do you want to talk about my calf?
We totally, let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. So I tore my calf a few years ago, tweaked my back a couple of times recently with deadlift. You had mentioned a term in our comment section episode that I've heard you refer to a couple of times as the double crush.
Double crush syndrome.
Yes.
It sounds terrible, doesn't it?
Right.
It does. It's like one of those terms where you're like, look, we should have come up with a new name.
So what does it mean? Am I actively crushing myself unnecessarily?
A double crush syndrome is where you have two insults to the nerve at two separate places.
Two insults?
Insults, injuries, irritations, okay. Right?
You're a bad calf. Yeah. You're a dumb calf.
You're a dumb. It's more the nerve in this situation. So he has something on his back that irritates a nerve right as it exits the spine. And then you have something at your calf, right? You have some fibrotic or you have the tear. And when the nerve passes through that area, that also sensitizes it chemically from that injury. And so now you have two separate spots where the nerve pathway that are irritating the nerve, and it becomes more compromised. Like the classic double crush syndrome is carpal tunnel syndrome, where people have like the hand pain, wrist pain. You have irritation at the wrist and you have irritation at your neck. Now you have carpal tunnel syndrome. You can treat either of them. You treat both of them, you get the best results. But if you treat one of them, it typically makes the other one better. And so people who have recurring carpal tunnel syndrome often have not had their neck treated. And that's why the treatment will fail. And even when you get like a release of the carpal tunnel, it won't always solve the problem if it's both issues.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like a compensation of one versus the other.
Yeah. You basically want to address both. Really, how our place operates, it's idea of like what's the key sign, find what thing hurts them, test it, apply treatments, and find out which one's the most effective. And what can often happen is people will hyper focus on where the pain is at, even though the best treatment response happens when you treat the neck. That's all I mean. You could totally sometimes we have where treating the hand completely resolves it, but often you have to treat both to fully resolve the issue.
And with it being nerves for my back and my calf, which once again, that diagnosis, I was like, I think he's crazy. But then you told me to do some nerve flossing, and that pretty quickly resolved it.
Everything comes back to what causes that threshold to lower or raise. And if you're cramping, the threshold for the muscle to fire is way too low. And so things like a double crush syndrome or a joint injury, they lower the threshold. And so you have to treat the double crush syndrome to then treat the cramp. You can't ignore that there's something else. Like the cramp is a symptom of something. Oftentimes it's not a diagnosis by itself. I don't think muscles typically just cramp. There's something that's driving it.
Yeah.
Right. There's another piece that's underneath it that's causing the person to be predisposed to it. You know, I actually just totally just remind me. The thing that made me really dive into this is I was on a triathlon forum, and this guy was having, he called it a calf heart attack.
I had one of those.
Yeah, it's an insane thing. And I gave him a whole program to follow, and he totally resolved it.
Nice.
And then what was happening with him was he was doing things that were, he literally was told that his calf, I think his calf was weak. I'm gonna have to pull it up and we have it on the forum. But he basically was doing things that actively were lowering the threshold, making it easier for him to cramp. And he was doing everything, like everything, getting a dry needle, getting massage. I mean,
probably stretching
the crap out of it, which helps in the moment because you activate the GTO. But if you don't consistently rework to get the threshold higher, like those momentary stretches don't do crap. They don't make it better for long term. The biggest piece on those is that you have to really understand what's driving the threshold change. And so in his experience, the threshold change was occurring because of the double crush syndrome.
Right. How common is this? I think I alluded to it a minute ago, but like I had never heard of these kind of layered diagnosis before. Is it super common, or
you mean that other people like providers are using it, or do you mean as in
just like in overall occurrence?
I think it's incredibly high. What I find happens is people who start to cramp, they start to avoid those activities unless they're really into that activity. For example, runners who have recurring calf cramps, volleyball players who have recurring calf cramps, hamstring injuries. Like those are the most common ones are going to be your calf, your hamstring, adductors, and quad. Like those are like the ones that I see the most often. And what I see is that people often self-select out. So then they just don't ever go into a position that will cause it. And that doesn't solve the problem. It just means you now kind of painted yourself into a corner. Or we have people who push through and then they basically try everything under the sun and then they still have the cramps. And then eventually that cramp leads to a more serious injury, like tearing their calf muscle, tearing their hamstring muscle, driving some other type of injury. That's typically what I see happens. And then that's often when we see them. But I think they're very, very common, like incredibly common. And then the other one that's really interesting is night cramps. They're treatable, and you have this whole idea that because there can be also, which we're not going to get into it today, you can have where there's a central issue, like there's something that's coming more from
like your nervous system,
spinal cord, yeah, that you lose some of the inhibition there as well. So we can jump more into that. It's one of the things that also can some evidence for increasing trigger points. But anyway, that type of thing we're not going to get into today. We can explore more in another episode, but it's so common. It is like incredibly common. It's just most people either self-select out or they get hurt to the point where they can't do the activity.
Mine is beach or sand volleyball. That's pretty much. I have cramped from playing indoor volleyball a couple of times, but pretty much any time I'm playing in a sand volleyball tournament, I usually end up making it to the finals, and then I cramp, and then I'm done. Like there's no coming back for me. So I'd be interested to hear your take on trying to come back in the moment. But in my experience, I have never come back from a calf cramp that day.
So we didn't talk about this beforehand. That's you cool with me pulling it apart?
Yeah.
All right. So we know that he has a history of a torn calf. We know that he has an issue with his back that interacts with that. And then on top of that, what's the biggest difference between sand volleyball, in my opinion, and the court is going to be the surface.
Correct.
Right? When you take off, do you jump differently?
I mean, in the sand, you have to.
What's different? What's different about it?
Indoor volleyball, you're going to broad jump. So you are kind of taking off, moving forward in more of a broad jump and, creating a lot of power when you're spiking. In the sand, you really have to go up and down to create enough power to get out of the sand and have any sort of vertical leap at all. And then it's also twos versus sixes. So you're not as active on the court in an indoor setting as where when you're playing outdoors in a double setting, you're covering the whole court. You're running back and forth. You might be blocking, then you're hitting, then you're running a ball down. And I feel like your leg muscles are just in a constant state of activation, especially when you're warming up, cooling down, warming up, cooling down, sometimes 5 or 6 times in a tournament setting. Your muscles just kind of on, off, on, off. And then by the time I would get to the finals, my calf would just be so fatigued that that thing would just lock up and it'd be like, well, we're forfeiting. So sorry. Yeah. So sorry,
so
partner.
That completely matches those. So the fatigue piece is actually really interesting that it hits in a different way. My mind immediately went to two things. Proprioception is going to be different, right?
What
so
is that?
Your ability to balance, like what sensory system you're going to be using. You're on a surface that's unstable versus a surface that's firm. So it's going to challenge your nervous system in a different way, right? But the other one is what I notice when people are playing volleyball is you jump more from being on like in a plantar flex position more often, and you land more in a plantar flex position. There's like with a broad jump, for example, when you land in a broad jump, you're often going heel to toe.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And so like you have this like kind of forward momentum where you're landing. So I think that you're not getting the same level of GTO activation throughout the activity. And so he's playing a whole game, and basically throughout the whole game, he's just systematically lowering the threshold. Right. And if you guys remember from our diagnostic talks and how we kind of work through the system, the first thing is to really understand what the problem is. We're going to kind of work through it. And then we would test what the theory is to see if I'm accurate, like what I would predict actually happens. So the first thing that we would want to have is like a key sign. We'd have them do a calf raise before, and then after each game, we'd have them do a calf raise again. And what we would look for is increasing tightness in the calf, like almost like the calf can't shut off. Does that make sense? And then what we'd want to see is that he's able to shut the calf off throughout the game and shut the calf off between the games so that he doesn't have this summation happen where all of a sudden he cramps and can't get out of it.
Heel walks?
Heel walks. I also think toe extensions. Like when you're waiting, what I've seen between sets, it's like you pull your toes up so you get reciprocal inhibition. That'll help to reset it. But then the other thing is he needs to fire all the muscles that also plantar flex the foot. Posterior tibialis, flexuralis longus, FDL, peroneus longus, and peroneal brevis. And you can do those in ways that won't really target the gastroc and the soleus, which is what he's cramping. Like those would be like my very first thoughts. And honestly, with what you're saying, like on how you're moving and everything, I think the solution, in my opinion, would be when you're waiting for somebody to serve. Like, so you just develop a routine. Somebody's going to serve or you're about to serve, pull your toes up. It's kind of like you're resetting it every time. But if you kind of think of it as a game, you're just trying to get the threshold to stay as high as you can. Because during the game, you may not be able to fully recover it. But if he actually can keep the threshold high enough for a long enough time, he's not going to have the cramp at the end. And then in between, like say he was doing volleyball tournaments every week, doing sand volleyball, your work between games and between tournaments would be totally focused on getting his threshold as high as possible so he doesn't fire his calf too easily.
Okay. I'm supposed to be playing next weekend, so
yeah, so toe walks. I like it.
All righty.
Yeah.
I'll start that. You had just mentioned kind of a diagnostic or a diagnosis process, so you want to jump into that?
Yeah, let's hit it.
Okay. Yeah. So I know in your clinics you have a pretty specific way of diagnosis when it comes to cramps. Well, your methodology.
Well, so the first thing is to really search to see if there's a pain generator that's driving it. So in my opinion, pain can also change where that threshold's at, and it can make this a muscle more predisposed to either being inhibited or overactive. And you want to find what structure is causing that original issue. So for example, with you, his back was a big piece of it, and that's something that we'd want to monitor. And so once you get a structural diagnosis, you want to make that pain generator be well managed and make it feel better. And that by itself can often correct or completely resolve people who are experiencing cramping. Now, after that happens, we want to find a key sign. If it's calf cramping, the easiest one is typically calf raises. And what you'll notice is, especially if it's a side to side difference, you'll find that one side it will feel substantially tighter, as in like it doesn't release when you quit doing the activity. It's almost like it stays contracted. You know what I'm talking about with that?
Oh, I mean, that's how it felt before I tore it. It was just tight, pretty much always, like 24/7. I couldn't get rid of the tightness.
So I guess another solution would be tearing your muscle.
That has solved it. Now that leg is just, I don't even think it's weak. It just feels different all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. I do think that there can be actual structural changes to the tissue that could also, I think, make it more irritable, make it more predisposed. But what I like to look for and a key sign is either it causes the cramp or it causes the muscle that cramps to feel like it gets tighter. And then from there, we apply a treatment that makes that feeling disappear. And then you use that as a feedback loop to basically ramp up the activity until it's gone. One of the things that I think our team does very differently is we're not afraid of the activity that causes a symptom, because in our mind, to really get you to be over the hurdle, you have to master the movement and master whatever that activity is, so that the activity actually becomes therapeutic and reduces the likelihood of that cramp to happen again, not be afraid of it and quit doing it. For example, with this, if I'm accurate, what's going to happen is his threshold is going to increase, and he's going to have a routine that basically always resets his threshold. And when he plays volleyball, he's actually going to feel better afterwards.
Part of me doubts that, but I guess we'll see.
I'm excited to see. We'll see. We'll have to see what actually happens. If there's people who have hamstring cramping, I'd love to go through cases on that one, because that's actually a really fun one. What I find on that one is most people don't understand how often they put their hamstring in a shortened position and fire it. I mean, just it's unbelievable, like how often that happens. And I often think, like, people who are side sleepers, they'll be in a position where they have it in a flex position, like a really active, insufficient position, and then they fire the hamstring, and they're like, I don't understand why it cramped, because you had it in a position that predisposed it to cramping,
like sleeping like the fetal position.
Yes.
Yeah.
And those types of things, I think they happen all the time, but in the moment they don't feel bad, and you just don't realize that you're changing the threshold so that even a mild activation causes it to go into full, we call it tetany, but a full contraction, which is a cramp.
What would, like, I know maybe you just hit it, but like, what's the key sign for, say, a calf cramp?
Calf cramp, my favorite one would be a single leg calf raise.
Okay.
And then if it hurts at the calf raise, or if the gold standard would be whatever can cause a cramp. So for example, we had a whole, I talked before in the previous episode about and causing the flexor torn brevis to cramp. The way we would do is we take the foot, fully plantar flex it, and then have the person curl their toes, hold it, and then resist it. They'd hold the position. If that didn't induce the cramp, then I'd grab their toes and try to pull them out of that position, and that always caused it to cramp. If that didn't cause a cramp, we would actually do electrodes at the same time. But we could get the muscle to cramp, and I would just basically keep them in that position, have them hold it as long as they could until it cramped. And that's kind of the idea of anything I can find like that. So if we train that, if we do a really good job, I can get people in that position and they can't cramp it. That's when I know that we've really solved the issue. For the calf cramp, I'll typically have them go into like a top position, unweight, like non-weight bearing if I can't get it with a single leg calf raise. And they just have them point their toe and then just hold it for a really long time, trying to squeeze their calf as hard as they can. That would be another one. Hamstring is really easy. You go on your stomach and you resist.
That one's very easy. Yeah.
The biarticulate component of it, and most people, their glutes don't fire as well as they should. So I would say the majority of the population is prone to this type of cramp. We can totally do a whole deep dive and get really specific on each muscle if we want to.
Yeah, I just feel like my calf capacity is so high that even before I was able to do calf raises and kind of go through all the things, and then all of a sudden the thing popped on me.
Yeah.
It's just slightly different than I think some of the other ones in terms of being able to like quickly make it cramp.
Well, yours is interesting. So to be honest, what I would have you do is I would probably have you take an hour beforehand. I'd probably see you after you play volleyball, and then I would have you come in when you're in a fatigue state. So if it's happening in a fatigue state, we call that increasing the signal. When you're in diagnosis mode, you're really thinking about getting the signal as high as you can and reducing the noise. For you, the fatigue sounds like such a huge issue that we would want to see you when you're fatigued.
Nice.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Next, we were going to jump into it, whether it's a local problem or not.
I look for systemic diseases. Like there's some things that could be predisposing you. If you're happening at more widespread, if it's not just a single place, if it's not like the same muscle over and over again, those are signs that there's a systemic issue. And that's actually something that you want to get checked out. But I've actually even had where there's a systemic issue that would predispose somebody to it, but it's happening locally. If it's local in one spot, you can typically have an impact on it.
From a physical therapy standpoint.
From a physical therapy standpoint.
Rather than a broader medical standpoint.
You got it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Are there specific medical conditions that you wanted to highlight?
Not really. I think it's more like if you have widespread cramping, that would be something that you would want to talk to your either whoever's helping to run your care for that systemic issue. You want to make sure you're talking with them about it. What I think is going to be interesting, where I think some of the research is going to go, is that we can have a bigger impact centrally on the state of your muscle. And I'm pretty excited where that type of literature is going. Right now, if it's related to your systemic problem, you want to manage the systemic issue. But if it's local, even though you have a systemic problem, then there's definitely an opportunity to make it better.
You're having widespread cramping, go see a primary care physician or whoever's taking care of
if you're having
conditions you may or may not have.
That was super nice. That was awesome.
Alrighty. I guess kind of closing out, was there any other items you wanted to hit on cramping?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I wanted to show the technical component and just challenge the idea that it's dehydration and electrolytes. And I think that we've done that. I know that we use some terms and we'll explore this more in some stuff on our website and do more of a deep dive, that if you're interested in reading and getting more clear examples. But if you're having cramping, it's a very specific area, and you've almost 100%, you've already been doing pickle juice, bananas, and crushing water like there's no tomorrow, or drinking Element, or what'd you call it? Liquid IV.
Yeah.
Or liquid death.
Liquid death is just water. I did pickle juice one time. I do not like pickles at all, and I was cramping down in a Rocky Point tournament, and I drank pickle juice for it, and it didn't help, and I was so upset that I drank pickle juice.
Oh, that's I love that you did that. It's kind of funny.
People are willing to try anything.
Let's do the mustard packets. I think is another crazy one. The mustard packets. What have you ever had? Yeah, mustard packets is the weird one.
That's just
pickle juice.
Not going to happen. I'm never doing pickle juice again. Apparently, it doesn't help anyway. So
I don't think it does. Now, so this is another one. I actually have a few case studies that we can already explore for next time. But if you're having one and you want to you want to have it as a case study that we review, just let us know. Put in a comment.
Yeah. If you want folks to remember one thing from this episode,
what is it? Your cramping is driven by what threshold your muscle fires at. The easiest way to make it better is to fire the opposite muscle. If it's your calf, fire your anterior tib. If it's your hamstring, fire your quad.
Boom. Alrighty. Check us out at pastureprime.com. Like, comment, subscribe, rate it high, share it with your friends. PYP.
PYP, baby.
Peace.